Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, good afternoon. I want to welcome all of you to today's session on all-in-one pricing, challenges, and strategies. My name is Mike Levision, and I'm the CEO of ALS Resolvion. For those of you that are not familiar with us, we're one of the leading repossession management and skip tracing services in the country. We provide forwarding, skip to repo, LPR management, and we also have a division that specializes in recovery of heavy equipment. We're one of the larger companies in the business. We currently handle approximately 40,000 new cases every month and repossess about almost 10,000 cars every month. And I attribute a lot of our success to really having our entire team focused on two very simple objectives, and that is generating better recovery results than others do, and doing it at lower risk to our clients. Those are just two things that we're really fanatical about. For those of you that we don't do business with, we'd certainly love to talk to you about it, but that's not why we're here today. And so that's going to be the extent of the ALS Resolvion commercial today. What we are here to focus on in today's session are the issues surrounding the establishment of a single repossession fee that covers not only the repossession, but also some or all of the additional services that can come into play on a repossession. And we're going to look at several facets of this. But before we get started, just a few housekeeping issues. First of all, I want to bring your attention to the control panel, which should be in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can open and close this panel by simply clicking on the little orange arrow. The panel basically just contains call-in information if you get disconnected, but there's also a question text box that you can use to ask questions. We do want to make this interactive and encourage questions and interaction, and so you can do that in two ways. One is through the text box that I just mentioned, but you can also post questions via audio as well. And to do that, you simply click on the little hand in the control panel, and that will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask and we can answer the question. Now, to pose a question via audio, you do need to be accessing the audio to this webinar via phone as opposed to computer connection. So if you think you might want to pose a question via audio, but you're on your computer connection, you can just dial back into the 800 number. Do make sure to include your audio PIN, because that enables us to identify you and essentially unmute you. We've got 3 designated periods for answering questions. So whether you submit by text or raise your hand, we'll handle it during those designated periods. If you submit it by text, we'll simply read it and attempt to answer. If you've raised your hand by clicking on the hand icon, we'll call on you and unmute your mic and allow you to ask at that point. And the question portion will be facilitated by my colleague Thi Chang, who's on the line with us, and she'll be coordinating all that. One more thing before we get started. So to promote further interaction, we have a few poll questions that we'll ask throughout. These will appear on the screen. Simply answer the question, and then once the results are tabulated, we'll share it with you. In fact, let's go ahead and do a poll right now. So you should see a question on your screen regarding any inquiries that regulators have made regarding around practices for certain types of fees. if you'll just go ahead and answer that. In a moment, I'll share the results. Okay, it looks like it's closed out. And you should be able to see the results now. So 73% said yes, 27% said no. So clearly this is an issue that's on regulator radar screens. Okay, let me hide that, and let's get started on the content. I think a good place to start would be to just make sure we're sort of all on the same page with regard to what all-in-one pricing actually is. And simply put, it is a single flat fee that covers the repossession service and other ancillary services. And the other services that it can cover are variable and can not only can vary lender by lender. There are a number of advantages to the all-in-one approach. The costs are pretty much all known up front, so you don't have to sort of figure that out on a case-by-case basis when you have a repossession. It also streamlines the operations and administration process. It can largely reduce or even eliminate the administrative burden of receiving multiple invoices and charges that come in post repossession that ultimately have to get posted to the customer's account and dealt with. And in some respects, it's more regulator friendly. It eliminates the issue of disparate treatment, which is always something that's high on the CFPB's radar screen. This approach also eliminates any financial transaction between the agent and the customer. Again, a pretty hot topic to the regulators. But there is some debate as to whether the whole approach is more regulator friendly or less regulator friendly, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. So there are some advantages, but it's also not without its challenges, for sure. As I'll show you shortly, coming up with an all-in-one pricing approach that makes sense and is sort of fair and reasonable to everybody requires a lot of data and a lot of analysis. And if you don't have that, you end up making a lot of assumptions, which can be dangerous. Some lenders, to the point I was making earlier about the debate as to whether or not it's regulator friendly or unfriendly, some have steered away from this approach because by definition, what happens is that some customers end up subsidizing services that didn't really come into play in their repossession. As examples, redemption, personal property, storage, even keys. Not all of these services come into play on every repossession, but in an all-in-one approach, there's an element of pricing for each of those in the fee that the customer paid. And then the last point that I list here is that this approach does shift significant risk to your vendor. As we'll go into in just a moment, there are many different variables, and these variables perform differently from lender to lender and portfolio to portfolio within a lender. And most times the data to do a good analysis of these different variables doesn't really exist. So vendors end up making assumptions, and if those assumptions are off, then it can create a real problem. And so you don't want to go into a strategy like this without addressing that, because it can unravel pretty quickly. And one other note I'll make as I go through this, this discussion all speaks to the issues as it relates to sort of the lender forwarder model. All-in-one pricing is even harder to apply in a direct agent model, and at least in our view, it's not necessarily impossible, but it's tough. And I'll I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if you go down this road, you really have to price for each of the different assignment types that you might be making. You've got involuntary repossessions, and most lenders have multiple tiers associated with that. You've got voluntary repos, skip repos, and again, in many cases, multiple tiers within that. LPR only repossessions and impound repossessions. And you really have to price for each one of these, and it's harder than it looks because the variables that I'm going to review with you shortly, the utilization factors of those different variables is different for each of these different assignment types, and that's really what makes this whole approach tricky. So the variables that I'm referring to, and you're all familiar with these. You've got the core repossession and skip related service, but then on any given assignment, you can have mileage request, flatbeds, personal property, redemption, key cutting, storage, and even transport. And obviously, you can't just assign the full cost of each of these different services to every repossession, because not all of these services come into play on every repossession. So if you just added the full cost, assuming that they were going to come into play, then you'd have an all-in-one price that was astronomical. Before I go any further, are there any questions? Do you have any questions been submitted?
Yes, so we have one question from Brian Donahue. Will a copy of the webinar deck be available?
Yes, it will. You'll receive it. You'll receive it this afternoon, in fact.
Yes, so we'll send an email out to everyone with a copy of the webinar deck, but there is also a handout available in the control panel. It's the PDF version of the webinar deck. So if you wanted to follow along using the PDF version, you can download it straight from the control panel as well.
So before we go on, we'll do another quick poll. This poll question is, does your institution have any type of pricing strategy that combines multiple services into one flat repossession fee? So I'm going to launch that now. Please just provide a quick answer, and we'll share that momentarily. Okay, it looks like everybody's done it, and I'll share it. But 50-50. That's right down the middle. So half the group is using some version of this now, and half the group is not. Interesting. Because I would say in our overall client base, that is, it would be a much smaller percentage that is using some form of all-in-one pricing. Thea, any final questions before I move forward?
Yep, we have one more question from Michael Stewart. Does the size of your portfolio make all-in-one pricing more complex?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily the size of the portfolio that adds to the complexity. The two drivers of complexity, and you'll get a better feel for this as we go through the rest of the presentation, are number one, which ancillary services you decide to include in that all-in-one price, because as we'll cover towards the end, we recommend a hybrid approach. But the more you include, the more complex it is. And then the other issue that drives complexity is what is your repossession assignment strategy look like? The more vendor rotations that you have, the more types of assignments that you have, the more complex that it can become. Okay, I'm going to move on. So now we're going to go through some of the variables to give you a better understanding of how they impact an all-in-one pricing model. So we'll start with mileage request. This is one that can have a significant impact. It is hard to mine the data to really come up with a clear understanding of the impact of mileage request on the overall pricing. You have to have insight into what percentage of the portfolio's cases typically involve a mileage request. What is the average excess mileage cost? And you even have to factor in the recovery rate on the portfolio. Very few lenders have this kind of detail on their business. Fortunately, we do track it on the business that we handle. And so here's 3 actual examples from our portfolio that illustrate the point. So lender A is a national lender. We get about a 51% recovery rate on their portfolio. They have a pretty good percentage of their loans that are outside of major metropolitan areas. So 10% of the assignments that we get from them have mileage request. And the average mileage request is $98. So on a per repossession cost, that equates to $19.22 that you have to load into the all-in-one price to cover mileage request. Lender B has got we have a 41% recovery rate on that portfolio. They have even a greater percentage of their portfolio in metropolitan areas, so fewer mileage requests, and the average cost of those mileage requests is smaller. So that works out to $10.54 per recovery in the case of that lender. And then lender C, even more concentrated in metropolitan areas, fewer mileage requests, lower cost, and you can see that the mileage cost load for that is just under $5. So just in this one variable, you see a pretty dramatic difference in the impact of excess mileage requests that has to go into the pricing model. Key cutting, another important variable and component. It's impacted by a number of different things. One is your key policy. Some lenders that we work with require an operable, a key that will operate the car when it leaves the lot. Others only want a key cut if it is necessary to access personal property. Another important variable is the percentage of recoveries in that portfolio that typically that require a key. Redemption rate can also has an impact on it. And then the very big component is the composition of the key mix. And this little table illustrates what I'm referring to. So we have one lender in our portfolio is a captive lender. We have to cut keys on about 10% of their vehicles, but almost the vast majority of the keys are proximity keys, and they're expensive, $235, which equates to $24 per recovery. Or roughly $24 per recovery that we have to load in. Another lender in the portfolio is a title lender. Again, 10% of the portfolio we cut keys on, but those keys, because they're much older cars, there's a much greater mix of standard keys, which are much less expensive. In that case, it's $144. So that equates to $13 per recovery on that portfolio that has to be built into the model. Redemption fees. This is a very interesting one because you see a lot of variation, not only by lender, but by portfolio within the lender. The redemption rate on a pre-charge-off portfolio is a pre-charge-off repossession is much different than a post-charge-off repossession or portfolio. And also, since again, this whole approach eliminates the transaction between the agent and the customer. The agent still needs to be able to bill either the forwarder or the lender, excuse me, for services that it renders. So, inherent in coming up with all-in-one pricing that includes things like redemption fees and personal property fees, where the agent does need to bill, you do need to establish parameters on what can be billed. Otherwise, it's impossible to understand the cost in the model. So here are three different scenarios that illustrate the impact. Portfolio A is a pre-charge-off portfolio of a prime lender. We have a very high redemption rate. The agent fees associated with the redemption are capped at $150. So the effective cost per repo relating to the redemption cost is $63 in that case. Portfolio B, again, a pre-charge-off portfolio. Redemption rate is lower. This is a subprime lender. Redemption rate's lower, and based on the allowable agent fees, the cost per redemption, or cost per repo for redemption-related cost, is $42. And then the third scenario, post-charge-off portfolio, obviously lower redemption rates, in this case 9%, and that only requires a $13.50 load into the pricing model. So again, you can see it's almost 5 times the difference between one scenario and another. Personal property, same basic point. You need to have an understanding of what percentage of cars that are recovered and not redeemed have personal property. And then again, an allowable agent fee has to be established. The agents do have real costs associated with managing personal property inventory. 3 different scenarios here, three different redemption rates or personal property recovery rates, and you can see that while the spread's not as great because this is a smaller ticket item, there is still variation from situation to situation, just based on changes in or differences in the redemption rates. Last but not least, transport fees. Now, I will say, including transport in an all-in-one pricing strategy is pretty extreme, but we do have a client that does it. It is particularly difficult to take into consideration because you have to factor in not only redemption rates, but also sort of average redemption cost, which is impacted by auction locations and some other factors. So, as it relates to this illustration, we've got again 3 different lender portfolios. Lender A, 24% redemption rate. The average miles for transport in their portfolio is 16 miles at a cost of $81. So on a per repo basis, almost $62 in transport-related costs that has to be built in. Lender B, a little bit higher redemption rate. Again, their portfolio is a little bit more spread out, and therefore the average distance and the average cost per transport is greater, and you can see that translates through to over $70 in transport costs for that per repo for that portfolio. Last example. Now this lender's got even a higher redemption rate, but they also use fewer auctions than many lenders do, and so that inherently increases the average distance for transport and therefore the cost. You can see in this example, in this portfolio, it translates through to almost $99 in transport costs versus only a little over $61 in example or portfolio A. Almost over a 50% difference there. So this slide attempts to bring it all together and illustrate how all these different variables impact the ultimate price. So we've got two portfolios here. These were both of these examples are forwarding or first placement business. The lender A is a prime lender, high redemption rate. They did not want to include all-in-one pricing in their formula. They did not want to include transport in their all-in-one formula, and so you can see how these different utilization factors and what they contributed to the overall cost of $570. Now, lender B is a subprime lender, lower redemption rates. And actually, I'm sorry, let me back up. I misspoke there. Lender A did want transport. In this case, I believe it was transport under 50 miles included in their cost and in their all-in-one price. And so that's what led to the $570 total fee. Lender B, again, subprime lender, lower redemption rates, did not choose to include transport. And that is dealt with separately. I'm sorry. That's dealt with separately. And so that just came out to $495. And then obviously, these very same lenders on their skip portfolios, or if they use an LPR staging strategy, then those models and those prices would look different because the utilization factor on all these different variables is different. Good time to pause and answer any questions that you have. Fee, do we have any?
Yes, so I do also want to open the floor up to our attendees. If you have a question, please use that hand raising feature and we will call on you and unmute your mic. So the first question comes from Esther Davila. So Esther, we're going to unmute your mic and allow you to ask your question. Hi Esther, can you hear us?
Yes, this is Esther Davila. So the question is, when you calculate your averages, are you calculating your average prices based on your customers, or are you using the general repossession nationwide average for what other companies charge?
Well, when it's a client or a lender that we've done business with and we have actual experience on their portfolio, we use that data. We have a very robust data warehouse, and so we're fortunate enough to have granular enough data to be able to actually know how the portfolio of existing clients actually behave. When that's not the case, we have to make assumptions. And I wouldn't say we make assumptions based on national averages, but we make assumptions based on portfolios that we have experience with that we think are very similar. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions, Thee?
Yes, so we have a text question from Michael Stewart. For the transport costs, are the recovery vendors being utilized or outside transport carriers?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
For the transport costs, are the recovery vendors being utilized or outside transport carriers?
Yes, in most cases, we will have the agent transport the vehicle. Now, there are many circumstances where that is not the case. We have some agents that don't provide transport services, and we have other situations where the transport distance is outside of what the agent is willing to do at a reasonable fee. But for the most part, we do look for the agents to. We give the agent the opportunity to transport if they want to. Obviously, it has to be within a cost structure that we feel is appropriate. Any other questions?
That's all our questions.
So it's probably pretty clear to you by now that the more components that you pack into the all-in-one pricing formula, the more complex it becomes. So I guess the question is, how do you strike the right balance? Because it's very hard to come up with something that includes everything that is sort of fair to everybody. So what we advise our clients to do is to take a hybrid approach, and to come up with a price that includes the repossession and skip fees, the core services, but also personal property and redemption. Those are the two areas that the CFPB has had the most concern about, and really within that, even more so on personal property. So include these three and leave the others components separate, and address those on a case-by-case basis as they come into play on any given case. Now, even to take this hybrid approach to the point I was making earlier, you do have to set clear parameters with the agent as to what they can bill back to you or to your forwarder. And our recommendation for that is that on personal property, that the maximum fee be $50 or state law, whichever is lower. On redemption-related costs, maximum administrative fee of $75, and then some allowance for storage, with a maximum total fees on a redemption of $150. So again, this is what we recommend. This is what we think strikes the right balance between what's fair to the agent, what's reasonable to the consumer, what's reasonable to the regulators. But different lenders have definitely taken different approaches on this. A few final suggestions if you decide to go down this road. Again, to my point earlier, I would not recommend this if you're using a direct agent model. It's hard enough to get something like this in place when you're working with 2 or 3 forwarders. It's even tougher if you're working with a lot more agents, and they typically don't have a deep enough understanding of the variables to really price it correctly, or to understand if what you're proposing is a fair offer. If you are working with forwarders and you want to go down this path, I would encourage you to make sure they're all working on a common set of assumptions. Because again, there's so many different variables involved, and they can perform differently. I would spend some time coming up with a common set of assumptions around these key variables, and then have them use the same assumptions. Have them all use the same assumptions in their pricing model. That way, you get a true apples to apples comparison, because we've seen this happen a number of times where 3 out of the 4 come in at a price that is pretty close to one another, and then one is just completely off the charts, either too high or either higher or lower, and it's because they didn't use the same assumptions. They didn't have access to the same data. Good example, to the point I made earlier, when we've had some clients that we've worked with for years go to an all-in-one approach. We had the data to properly analyze it. Well, they went out with an RFP that included us and the vendors they do business with, and the vendors that they don't, and some vendors they don't do business with, and the vendors that they've worked with had data to make informed assumptions. The other vendors did not, and so the pricing came back, totally different, and that'll create problems. Once you do, get all this set up and launch it, definitely have a mechanism in place for tracking the performance under these different variables. Even if you didn't have it originally, and the pricing is based on best guess assumptions, you definitely want to track these things going forward, because in all likelihood there will have to be adjustments made to the the agreed upon price down the road. It's either going to work out to be too high or too low. And you really won't know that until you have some actual experience. And even with the experience, you only know it if you've been able to track the actual utilization of these different variables. Final opportunity to ask questions.
All right.
Anything,
so
Thee?
Let's open the floor to questions. Again, you can submit a question via the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll unmute your mic. So the first question is a text question from Michael Stewart. From the clients you work with, are the clients providing the price, or are forwarders providing the pricing?
I would say in the majority of cases so far, well, let me back up. It's a little bit of both. We have clients that have taken a very, I'll call it comprehensive approach to all-in-one. In other words, they're trying to put a lot of stuff in it. And in those cases, in most of those situations, they've asked us to work up a price and come back with it. Because frankly, they don't have the data in most cases to understand what the pricing should be. Now, we have other situations where the lender has taken a more limited approach to all-in-one pricing, where it's only including the repossession and personal property fee, or repossession, personal property, and redemption. In some of those cases, they have come back with, this is what we think is appropriate, and it's up to us to assess and ultimately accept or reject that price. So it's a little bit of both, and it sort of depends on the scope of what the lender's trying to include. Anything else, Thee?
Nope, that is all of our questions.
Okay. Well, let me wrap this up. I hope you found the session to be informative and helpful. We do plan to continue. This is the second of our Insights webinar series. We do plan to continue to have these roughly on a quarterly basis. And each one will cover a very practical, relevant topic that can help you, deepen your understanding of the business or help you make your business better. We plan to do the next one in April, so keep an eye out for announcements around that. We haven't selected the final topic yet, but that should be shortly. Last comment I would make is that, and it's very important, your feedback is critical to the success of these webinars. We want to improve them, make them better each and every time. And the only way that happens is if we get your feedback. So you will receive an email from us this afternoon. As we mentioned earlier, it'll have a copy of the deck attached, but it'll also have a link to a very brief survey. It'll take you less than a minute to complete. But if you will please give us the feedback while it's still fresh in your mind, we will absolutely take it into consideration as we look to improve these as we move forward. And then very last point is I want to encourage all of you, if you're not already a member of the Lenders Repossession Best Practices Forum on LinkedIn, I want to encourage you to join. We have about 175 lenders in the group now. It's only open to lenders, and it's a great forum for exchanging ideas, learning about what others are doing. We publish a lot of interesting content, and you've probably seen some of it, but we put it into we post it on the Best Practices Forum first, usually a couple weeks in advance of any other distribution. So if you go to LinkedIn and just search on the Lenders Repossession Best Practices Forum, you'll find it very easily. I want to thank you for your participation today, and look forward to you participating again in the future. Good afternoon.